Double Dragon. That classic 1987 side-scrolling beat-em-up everyone was familiar with, and if not, it was the one that looked like this. Anyway, this got popular for some reason. And when something gets popular, it usually gets ported over to a billion home video game formats, and here's one of them. Double Dragon released in 1992, April of 1992, for the Sega Genesis courtesy of Accolade under their Ballistic brand name, which was also a thing for some reason. Double Dragon was released months between Streets of Rage 1, which was released in 91, and Streets of Rage 2, released in December of 92, which gave you a nice Lee Brothers spread between two slices of bare-knuckle bread. Weird thing is that before this came out, Double Dragon 2 The Revenge was released for the Japanese Mega Drive in 91. So let me get this straight. Somebody ported the sequel first, then somebody else ported the original Double Dragon, and finally along came the last two piles of shit that aren't worth getting chronologically confused over. Anyway, Double Dragon is old hat. Girl gets punched in the belly, taken captive, and it's up to Billy and Jimmy Lee to venture through 4 missions of kicking ass and taking names to rescue the girl before anything bad happens to her, or rather rescue the girl and delay the inevitable because... You know, in hindsight, maybe we should just let him have her. She'd live longer, or not. Who knows? Who cares? It's just a bunch of pixel. It doesn't really matter. So the Genesis version of Double Dragon is more of a straight arcade conversion as opposed to the Nintendo conversions. 4 missions of side-scrolling beat-em-up action where you beat up a bunch of dudes and the occasional dudette with your fists and feet as well as the occasional dropped weapons. There's a platforming bit or two in the 3rd mission and some hazards to avoid in the 4th and final mission, but that's about it. The rest of it is beating up baddies before they gang up on you and pummel you to a pulp. Which happens quite often, actually. Double Dragon on Genesis sports a 3-button setup, one for punch, one for kick, and one for jumping. There's a button customization feature, but it seems to be broken because every time I try to reassign something, say button C to jump, I'll do that in the options, but in execution, button C will kick instead. Probably the biggest pet peeve I have with these controls, but certainly not the only one. Also in the options, the game lets you set your starting number of lives as well as continue credits, which I would max out because the gameplay in Double Dragon is, I'm sorry to say, somewhat jank. And then they brought it over to the Mega Drive. Look, I'll say this much. Double Dragon at least runs fine on the Genesis. It didn't have the chugging bouts of slowdown that the arcade version occasionally suffered from at times. It still had the annoying quirk where the screen scrolls if you're too far to the right, which is arcade accurate, but still kinda shit. You know, if you're gonna scroll, you should try to center your character a bit so you have more room to react, but that's just me. 2-player simultaneous gameplay has been retained, which should be a no-brainer, but you know, some games opt to leave that out due to constraints and such. If you wanted an arcade-accurate conversion of Double Dragon at the time, this Mega Drive port came closest to achieving that for its day, which isn't saying a whole lot considering Double Dragon came out in 1987, and the Mega Drive should be more than capable of replicating that Double Dragon experience, because if not, then we've got a problem. Double Dragon has 2 things going against it: spotty collision detection and somewhat wonky controls. I've already complained about the controller mapping, but there's also a quirk in response time, particularly in regards to pulling off moves like jump kicks and elbow bashes. I don't know whether to call it lag or just strict timing, but it does feel a bit off at times. Also, collision detection also has a tendency to be a bit spotty at times. It's not completely broken, and to be fair, the arcade original was never a smooth experience even at its best, despite what some people would have you believe, but it feels a little more off here. Also not helping matters is the fact that enemies come across as more aggressive in this Genesis port, which makes the game a bit more difficult than it probably should be or intended to be. Now that alone would take the Genesis port down a notch or two, but all of that is balanced out with the ability to set your lives and credits, which should be enough to see you through the end of the game with all the settings maxed out if you really need it. And if you don't, more power to you. Other than that, the gameplay is fairly solid, runs at a decent pace even with a bunch of folks on screen. It's one of those cases where the home versions sometimes feels a bit tighter than the arcade original in some places, but doesn't quite nail a smooth landing. It's a bit odd, but not necessarily in a bad way. Double Dragon looks fairly accurate on the Genesis. It's not a full-on recreation of the arcade visuals so much as it's a fair approximation at least. The characters here look fairly close to the source material, with only the smaller size being the difference. The heads-up display is pretty spot on as well. The various levels look fairly decent to true to form. I've heard some people complain that the colors were a bit muddier in this port, but I think it's the opposite actually. It's actually a bit brighter color-wise in some places compared to the arcade original, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It looks fine. Sound's also fairly adequate. This version's missing the sampled sound effects of the arcade game, but the sounds they added here aren't too shabby. There's even a distinct sound effect that plays when you land a blow on a foe who's one combo away from death. Though I think this was a regular feature in other versions as well. But whatever, I just noticed it here. Double Dragon also retains the arcade soundtrack, and it sounds pretty good on the Mega Drive. Probably higher quality tunes than the arcade original, which tends to sound a bit tinny at times. Yeah, sorry, it does, but whatever. Overall, Double Dragon for the Sega Genesis is probably one of the better, if not best, home conversions of the arcade original you could have gotten at the time, despite a couple bits and bobs not quite being up to par. In terms of replicating that arcade experience, it probably comes closest to pulling that off. That said, nostalgia is a driving factor towards whether you'll enjoy Double Dragon, as even in 1992, the game was a product of its day on a console with plenty of superb belt brawlers that blow the Lee brothers out of the water. Still, as a port of a classic arcade game that sticks to the basics, this is as good as you'll get short of straight up arcade emulation or enhanced remakes.